Well, the left-wing blogs informed me yesterday that John Oliver had returned to his HBO show to deliver another epic smackdown, this time destroying, demolishing, eviscerating anti-prostitution laws. Oliver is quite sure that there is no good reason for prostitution to be illegal. He's even more sure that it's mostly just a bunch of repressed puritanical bumpkins who still support such laws. Now, he begins his segment by playing some kind of weird 1950s PSA about wet dreams. Don't ask me why. Then he proceeds to list a bunch of sex positions while the audience cackles uproariously. This is just great comedy. Watch this.
Specifically tonight, we're going to talk about sex work. And the concept is pretty simple. Let's say you have sex, any kind, missionary, doggy, cowgirl, cowboy, the eagle, the wheelbarrow, the wild Chincoteague pony, the Jerry Seinfeld, the pick-me-up, the put-me-down, mouth-butt, butt-mouth, mouth-mouth, butt-butt, butt-butt, mouth-butt, you know, whatever. But then that's it. You go home. It's fine, right?
So you see there why Oliver needs the crutch of a live studio audience? Because without the mindless drones laughing, that would have just been a sex-crazed, schizophrenic, randomly shouting a bunch of sexual terms into the abyss. With the laughing, it's still that, but at least the people in the room are enjoying it, I guess. But it sets the stage for what's to come. Oliver proceeds to lay out his case for decriminalizing prostitution everywhere in the country. He has 25 minutes to present the argument in favor of prostitution, but wastes most of it talking about alleged instances of abuse by the law enforcement officers tasked with policing the practice. So he mentions, for example, a report claiming that officers in sting operations sometimes have sex with the prostitutes before arresting them. Now, we can all agree that if that's happening, it's wrong and horrible and exploitative. But it has nothing to do with whether prostitution should be legal or illegal. There are plenty of cases of police officers mistreating murder suspects, but that doesn't mean murder should be legal. So before we talk about how these laws are enforced, and I personally think they should be enforced by first and foremost penalizing the pimps and traffickers themselves, before we can do that, we need to figure out if the laws should exist at all. Oliver doesn't really have a lot to say about that subject, even though it's ostensibly the subject of his episode of this episode of his show. But let's listen to his case for whatever it may be worth. He starts things off by drawing what actually is a valid comparison, and one that listeners of this show have already heard many times. Listen to this.
Very basically, sex work is the exchange of sex for money or goods. And in the United States, a complicated patchwork of local, state and federal laws makes that act illegal everywhere except for a few counties in Nevada. And if you're thinking, well, hold on, John, didn't Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie have sex for real in Don't Look Now and also get paid at least scale? Wouldn't that be illegal? The answer is one, yes, I also believe that rumour. Great reference. And two, that is actually legal because of the presence of the camera, making it an art film, otherwise known as porn, and thus legally covered as part of free speech. So basically, consensual sex for money on camera is legal porn, and consensual sex for money off camera is illegal sex work. Makes sense, right? Wrong? Well, exactly. Everything about the way we regulate sex work in this country is confusing and counterproductive.
Oh, where have I heard that before? I mean, you're right, John. That is, in fact, a point that I have made many times, and people on your side of the ideological divide have mocked me relentlessly for it. I guess I need to say it with a British accent for it to be credible. Pornography is prostitution on film. It fits the definition in every sense of the word. It makes no sense for prostitution to only be legal when there's a camera filming it. In fact, if you could only outlaw one form, the filmed or unfilmed variety, it would make more sense to outlaw the former because it has more participants. Either way, there's no denying the contradiction in the way that our laws treat prostitution as opposed to how they treat pornography. My answer to that contradiction is to make all of it illegal. His answer is to make it all legal. And let's find out why.
But a human history's worth of laws hasn't changed the fact that, one, sex work has always been part of society, appealing to every interest and every kind of clientele, and two, sex workers are not a monolith. People from a variety of backgrounds do it for a variety of reasons. And the fact is, our current system of criminalising the trade and driving everyone underground is actually only making life harder for the most vulnerable involved. And given that sex workers are, and this is true, people with thoughts about their own situation, we thought tonight we'd actually listen to.
So here John offers two incredible insights. One, he points out that prostitution has always been around. And two, he observes that some of the people doing this illegal thing would prefer if it were not illegal. Now, Both of these points may seem rather obvious and irrelevant, but remember that he dropped an F word in there, which automatically makes his point both powerful and clever and funny. Yes, we know that there have been prostitutes for as long as there's been human civilization. That's why the old cliche about the world's oldest profession. But we've also had murder and rape and child abuse and every other bad human activity for as long as we've had humans. The fact that people have been doing something for a long time and will always do it doesn't automatically mean that there should be no laws against it. If it did, then there shouldn't be laws against anything, because the only things we need laws against are precisely those things that human beings tend to do. If nobody did it, we wouldn't need to outlaw it. As for the point that anti-prostitution laws ignore the perspective of prostitutes, that wouldn't be relevant if it were true. Because again, pointing out that the people doing the illegal thing don't like that it's illegal is not really relevant, but it's also not true at all. Because some of the most vocal anti-prostitution voices in the country are people who've been rescued from that life. Prostitution is bad. It harms people. It harms everybody involved in one way or another. There's a reason why prostitutes, just like people in the porn industry, have astronomically high rates of substance abuse, suicide. Any law that could potentially prevent people from getting involved in this activity or deter them from it, or at least any law that fails to condone it, is good for the prostitutes or potential prostitutes themselves, even if they don't always have the self-awareness and foresight to see it that way. You know, it's pretty common for people who are stuck in a self-destructive cycle to defend their self-destructive activity and to get very angry at anybody who tries to stop them from doing the self-destructive thing. But that doesn't really mean anything in terms of what the law should be. Now, we'll return to that point in just a moment, but first we'll continue listening to Oliver's argument, such as it is. So far, he hasn't really presented any reason to decriminalize it. Perhaps he finally gets to that point here.
This story is going to be about the fact that sex work is inarguably labour. It is a job, and people do it for the same reasons that people do any job, as this advocate explains.
Sex work is inherently work. It's how people feed their families. It's how people put clothes on their backs. It's how people survive. I mean, I've been a sex worker. I've been a lawyer. I've served sandwiches at Subway. I folded clothes at Abercrombie. All those are work.
Right. It's all work.
Okay. What's your point? Yes, those are all things you did for money. You folded clothes at Abercrombie. You were a prostitute. You were a lawyer, which some would argue is more of a lateral move. All of that is work if by work you simply mean a task performed for financial compensation. But what does that prove? Are you saying that anything done for money is automatically good or should automatically be legal? That's quite an interesting take from the same people who also tend to be critics of capitalism. What about child pornographers? What about hired assassins? What about Bernie Madoff running a Ponzi scheme? All of that is work done for money. If you don't think that all of it should be legal, then you're saying that there are certain types of jobs, certain types of work that nobody should be legally allowed to do in a civilized society, even if they use it to feed their families. The question is whether prostitution ought to be in that category or not, and that is a question you still have not really answered, and never do, but we'll keep listening.
To those who are still uncomfortable here, out of a concern that there are people who feel economically forced into sex work, I totally agree with you. That is a huge problem, but the fact is, our current laws are not addressing that. If you want to do that, that's a much bigger conversation to have, because fundamentally, the only way to make sure that people have a choice in the way they earn money is to make housing affordable, healthcare accessible, and to not burden marginalised people with criminal records that lead to a cycle of joblessness, homelessness, and desperation. But until such time as we have that conversation, and it does not seem like something enough people are itching to have right now, we need to stop pursuing policies that harass, endanger, and occasionally refrigerate sex workers, and instead start listening to what they actually want. Because unfortunately, if we don't do that, we're just going to carry on looking like a bunch of clowns.
Well, speak for yourself, John. Now, he once again returns to the point that people who are currently prostitutes do not want prostitution to be a crime. Again, I must remind him that most of the people currently engaged in all types of illegal activity probably would prefer if the activity was not illegal. That doesn't really help enlighten the issue at all. Nor does it do anything to negate the real reason why prostitution is illegal almost everywhere and should remain so. And that is this. Prostitution is human trafficking by definition. It is the human body sold as a good, an object. That's also what distinguishes prostitution from legitimate forms of work. With legitimate labor, you are providing a good or service in exchange for money. In prostitution, you are the good. You are the service. This is also how you differentiate, ZipRecruiter from a slave auction. You're not buying the slave's labor, really. You're buying him. The slave himself is the commodity, and so is the prostitute. The prostitute gives herself up to be used and discarded. It is inherently dehumanizing, degrading, violent, despair-inducing. Oliver mentions how poor and vulnerable people tend to be the ones on street corners offering to perform oral sex on strangers, which is true, but he never stops to ask himself why. Putting the law aside, why is it almost always poor and desperate people who end up going down this dark road? There are exceptions, of course, and the internet version of prostitution provides many of those exceptions, but the vast majority of the hookers on street corners are poor, desperate, drug-addicted girls. That's not going to change by making it legal. It's not like if you legalize it, suddenly a bunch of middle-class, financially stable women are going to flock to the corner hoping to get their turn humping a random dude in a car parked by a dumpster. This is something that only people in dire straits do because it is debasing, humiliating, dirty, and shameful. And dangerous. That's not an argument for making it legal. And if you think it is, I have to question not only your common sense, but your basic moral judgment as well. Now, the prostitute apologist will say that the prostitutes are acting consensually. But we know that's not true in a great number of cases. Many of these girls are physically forced and coerced into it. And again, you're not going to alleviate those cases by making the practice legal. Pornography is legal, and that certainly hasn't done anything to put a dent in the child porn business. The effect has gone entirely the other way. As for prostitutes, many did not choose that life. That's reason enough to keep it illegal. But even the ones who appear to have chosen it didn't really choose it. People who think they have choices don't become prostitutes. You'd think this would be obvious to the left, especially, as they're the ones who say that a boss having sex with his subordinate is automatically a rapist because the power dynamics make consent impossible, right? That was the Me Too logic. Now, if they can apply that principle to the workplace, where it should not actually be applied most of the time, how can they exempt prostitution? But however you look at the consent question, the fact remains that prostitution is human trafficking. It is the buying and selling of human beings. It is exploitation of the most degrading and dehumanizing kind. Whether everybody agrees to the arrangement, or nobody does, or some people do but others don't, or whatever other combination, it still should not be legal. And John Oliver is still today certainly canceled. Well, I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Matt Walsh Show. If you did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right down there so you can stay up to date on all of our future content.